Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I know Mara can send out the documents after class, but I will also just put the links in the chat. There are two separate documents. So anyone can open them right now, and then I will restrict access after the class. And if you want a copy, you'll be able to get that from Mara. So I'm putting those in the chat. Okay, and we're going to start with the slides. So for those who were here last week, we talked about the God of love in preparation of Passover, thinking about the theme of love in our own lives, primarily in connection to Song of Songs, but also other texts that we read that in connection to Passover. So I shared with many of you last time that I was sort of sad to say goodbye to the love session. They were texts that I found really meaningful and profound. But today I think we'll also, maybe on a more serious note, we'll be looking at the God of the stranger. And for those who were here last week and also here this week, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on both sessions. So I'm gonna share my screen and we'll start. Whoops, Mara, can I just, can you enable me to share my screen? Okay, thank you, let's see. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, this should be it. Okay, great. Whoops, let me just, I have a few things here. Okay. Okay, so I'm not going to go into full screen, into slideshow, because it's easier to see a couple of the notes on the bottom, and just it's easier to see you also. So I guess it should come as no surprise that we are exploring the God of the stranger before Passover. If it is surprising to you and you're wondering why we're doing that, I want to start by taking a look at a passage in the Haggadah, the booklet that we use at the Passover Seder, which of course has many variations. And we'll take a look at that text, and then we'll also take a look at a couple of Torah texts. So, okay. Oh gosh, okay. So I by accident deleted the slide, so I'll just have to tell you about it. Okay, so I'll read, and then my plan is for us to, in between kind of sections of what we do today, we will, I'll pause for questions. And I believe the chat is open, and so I certainly invite you to share your thoughts in the chat. It's very difficult for me to pay attention to it while we're speaking, but when we pause for questions, maybe Mara, you can just glance through and see if there are any like overarching questions for people. So in the Haggadah, it says, in every generation, a person is obligated to see oneself as one who personally went out from Egypt. And this comes from an idea in the Torah, which we'll talk about. It is our duty, therefore, to thank and to praise, to glorify and to extol God who performed all these wonders for our ancestors and for us. God took us out from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, from darkness to great light, and from bondage to redemption. Let us therefore sing before God a new song. So in the Haggadah, and this is sort of after the whole Magid section, after the whole section of retelling the story, this appears before we traditionally recite what's called the Hallel, a group of psalms praising God. So here in the Haggadah, an idea lifted from the Torah is that each of us in multiple generations after the story of the Exodus, we have to see ourselves as we went out from Egypt. And sometimes I think when actually we pause to do that, it's quite profound and almost, it's hard to kind of stay with that thought. If I imagine myself as a slave and being free, it's very difficult. I would say what is not as difficult, I hope, is just the empathy that this is supposed to cultivate in us. Clearly, this is supposed to make us think, how can I try and put myself in someone else's shoes, in my ancestors' shoes? And the other thing that I wanted to share with you as we begin the study of God of the stranger is, and I by accident deleted, and actually, let me just, you bear with me for a second. No, it's going to take too long. Okay, so I'm just going to have to tell you that in Deuteronomy, in the second set of the 10 commandments, there's a different reason for keeping Shabbat in comparison to the reason given in Exodus. In Exodus, for observing Shabbat, or for remembering Shabbat, we're supposed to emulate God who rested on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy, and you can look this up, it's Deuteronomy chapter 4, we're told that we have to rest, our households have to rest, and every single living creature in our households have to rest, because we know what it was like to be a slave in Egypt, and we have to then now make sure that other people, other living creatures, not just humans, the ger, the stranger among us, our animals, everyone has to, in our household, rest on Shabbat. So there's, because of, there are, I think it's pretty, it's profound to think about such an important Jewish practice, traditionally speaking. The reason given for that is we were strangers in the lands of Egypt, and so everyone in our household has to rest. And then finally, I wanted to show you again, by way of introduction, that in Leviticus 19, there are laws, in some of you may have heard of these, about leaving, for example, a corner of your fields, a section of your vineyard for the poor, and the stranger is included in this. So here, for example, rather for the afflicted and for the sojourner, the ger, and I'll define that in a moment, you are to leave them. These sections of the field, I am God, your God. So certain key laws like Shabbat and making sure that part of our homes and our land we allot to the poor. The reason given for those practices is directly connected to empathy and directly and implicitly connected to being a stranger in a strange land. So I wanted us to begin by thinking about the central role that the stranger plays in some of these laws, in the laws that we just are noting here. And also we're going to see more examples, direct examples in the Torah of a stranger, of the ways in which the ways with dignity and respect that we are supposed to treat a stranger. So we're going to expand on these notions and switch to the Google Doc here. And I want us to start in a similar way to the way that we started last week, with some of the core questions and ideas that I shared. There are, of course, and we'll see, especially with some of the more difficult texts that we get to, there are many different approaches in the Hebrew Bible to many different things. And what we're looking at together today is texts that are positive and that are about treating the stranger, or even later on, the Gentile, with respect and dignity. And of course, there, as I'll share with you a little bit later, the texts outside the Bible present a much greater difficulty with embracing or treating the stranger with respect. The texts that are written in the Bible are extremely clear about treating the stranger in the image of God with as much respect and dignity as possible. So we're going to start there. And if you think about, oh, I can think of a text that counters what Abby is presenting to me today, I invite you to think about, well, which text do you want to anchor yourself in? Which text do you want to use as your starting point? And I mentioned last week that that I think a lot about that. And I heard a Shai Held's lecture who uses the phrase starting point, not just anchor or grounding. When we think about the variety of texts and the variety of approaches, some which might be inspiring and which may speak to our contemporary sensibilities, and some which may not. So in the book of Exodus, I think there are so many powerful texts about the ways in which we should treat the stranger, the ways in which the Israelites should treat the stranger. But this is one of them. And just to contextualize what we're doing here, after the 10 Commandments are given on Mount Sinai, there are many other laws that are given, and the setting is still supposed to be Mount Sinai. And there are all sorts of laws, civil, criminal related laws. You can see I gave you a little bit of a detailed summary at the top of the screen. And then in the middle of chapter 22 and chapter 23, we have these seemingly random verses about strangers. So the Hebrew is there for you to follow along. I'm going to read the English. You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat him, I will heed the outcry as soon as they cry out to me. And my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword. And you and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. So I don't know if you're reacting like me, but I could read this text. I've read this text many times over the past week, and every time it's powerful. Exodus 23, you shall not oppress the stranger. Why? You know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the lands of Egypt. So in these texts, we have God looking out for the stranger, and then God asking us to behave in God's image and also protect the stranger. We have a parallel protection going on. And why? Because of empathy, because we know it's not just the text doesn't say your ancestors were strangers in the land of Egypt, so you have to treat other people with respect, other strangers with respect. That's not what the text says. Certainly that's what the text means, but that we are supposed to put ourselves and imagine ourselves as a stranger, a foreigner, get a sense in our hearts of what that feels like, and behave accordingly with kindness and respect. Not always easy to do in a situation where we encounter someone different from us. I wanted to point out also here, you can see I have a note that there are multiple verbs used to describe the appropriate behavior for a stranger. And I also just wanted to mention here that what the Torah means by a stranger is, and I think you may have seen in some of the translations already, or you'll see shortly, is a resident alien, a non-Israelite who lives among you. As you may know from the Torah, the story goes that the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan, but it seems like they still lived. It does not seem like that only Israelites lived in the land of Israel. There were multiple nations. And so the text isn't talking about someone who lives kind of in another community. The text is talking about someone that lives among you, a resident alien. And the rabbis take this a step further and create a rabbinic category called a ger v'toshab, a resident alien, but it's less common of a category in ancient times than it was in biblical times. So I want to take a look, and I just want to ask everyone to mute because I'm hearing some background noise, and I want to make sure, I don't know where it's coming from, but I just want to make sure for everyone they can hear clearly. And just for my Jewish learning, there's a recording. I would be happy if there weren't a recording. I don't like hearing my own voice, but I just want to make sure it's clear for everyone. So, okay, so I want us to now spend some time with a medieval commentary with Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who was French and died in 1105. So by the time we get to medieval times, in Hebrew, the word for stranger, ger, doesn't only mean resident alien. In fact, it really doesn't mean resident alien. It means convert. And this is not a class on conversion and on how we treat the convert, though we will touch on that. But I want us to maybe interpret Rashi's commentary with some contemporary sensibilities and think about, well, how would this impact our notions of how we treat someone among us who we do experience as different from us, as someone who is an other. And by I don't mean another, I mean someone who we experience sort of in the category of other, like different from us. So Rashi comments on verse 20, and you can see I highlighted a few things that I wanted to pay attention to. Rashi says, what does it mean that you should not wrong a stranger, do wrong, maltreat, just that one word, lo toneh? Rashi says, you should not vex him with words. You should not speak inappropriately to a stranger. Rashi is suggesting this doesn't mean acting a certain way. Of course, speaking is also a way of acting, but there's a focus here on speaking. And then what does the next verb in the pasuk, in the verse mean? Lo tilchatzenu. Rashi says, based on an earlier midrash, an earlier interpretation of the text, it means you should not rob the stranger of money. So this is very typical of midrash, of reading into the text, something that we would maybe take abstractly, poetically. The ancient rabbis want to read the text extremely literally, and Rashi is doing that here. And then we do get something a little bit more abstract. In Rashi's comments on Ki Gerim Hayitem, you were strangers yourselves, Rashi says, if you anger a stranger, that stranger can also anger you, because the stranger could say to you, well, you also descend from strangers. Why are you picking on me? You think I'm so different from you? You also come from a people of strangers. And then Rashi comments here based on an earlier midrash, and I think this is one of the best texts today that we'll look at. If you, a fault which is yours, do not raise with another person. In other words, do not rebuke her for something you also do wrong. For this, okay, I have to edit that a little bit to make the English translation a little better. Wherever ger, stranger, occurs in scriptures, it signifies a person who has not been born in the land where he is living, but has come from another country to sojourn there. So Rashi just explains here, also I left that in, just sort of a side comment, just making sure you know the context of what we're talking about here. But this is a text I really want to call our attention to. In addition to the rabbinic, very literal interpretations, breaking down sort of a poetic verse into very specific ideas, Rashi also has this quote from an earlier midrash. Before you criticize someone, check inward, Rashi's saying, and see, like, is this a fault? Am I getting annoyed because this is my own fault, because I've done something wrong? Because there's a part of me that I don't like, and I'm projecting that onto another person. I don't know about you, but I've done that more times than I'd like to admit, but I am admitting. So I think it's again, thinking about empathy in the context for Israelite ancestors, putting ourselves in the shoes of the stranger, of the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt, then putting ourselves in the shoes of strangers who live among us. There's a profound empathy that both the text itself and also the rabbinic texts raise here. So before we go on maybe to a few more Torah texts and maybe a little bit more interpretation, I want to pause and see if there are any questions, any clarification questions or general questions on the Torah text so far on empathy and treatment of the stranger. Any clarification questions?
So I'm not sure if this was addressed as you went on, but Ma'ira asked about 3 verbs. She said, and so Ma'ira, if you're here, do you want to raise your hand and maybe we can flesh out this question a little bit more? Okay.
Okay.
Then Abby, do you want to speak just a few more, a little bit more on what those 3 verbs are?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. Let's go back up to that text. Okay, so I mean, there are different words used. The Hebrew root lamed chet sadi does generally mean oppress. Toneh could be a general wrong. Everett Fox later translates it as maltreat or mistreat. Aneh te'aneh, similar to toneh, but not the same root, often means afflict. So I think my sense is, why those specific verbs, I don't know. I mean, beyond the Torah using multiple verbs to help us to really hone in on the point that there are different ways that you can oppress. There are different ways that you can mistreat, and we should be mindful of any way that we're inclined to mistreat another person or a stranger in particular here, and catch ourselves on those inclinations.
Thank you.
Any other clarification questions or reflections at this moment?
Cody is asking about emphasizing the difference between family and the stranger. And what in the I assume Talmudic concepts.
Cody, I if you're available, I don't know what I need some clarification on the family piece here. I don't know what you're referring to, unfortunately.
So we do have
it was just a general question. I'm not that familiar with the Talmud.
Yeah.
Right. That's why I was essentially asking. Obviously, the nature of the talk here today is about the stranger. So that's what I was just asking about, the difference. Obviously, you're the one giving the class, that kind of thing. So I just figured you would have more of a breadth of knowledge about it. That's that kind of thing. It was just a general question. It wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, there are a whole different set of laws and practices related to treatment of family members, like ways in which we respect parents, ways in which parents are supposed to respect children, siblings. So, maybe we can do another class on that.
It was just a question as to like an isolated example or something like that. That was all.
Yeah, I mean, the primary teaching in the Torah is about respecting your parents in the 10 Commandments. And unfortunately, there is a very disturbing text about a rebellious child. And that the Torah says that a child who is rebellious can be stoned to death. But the rabbis say that never happened. There are multiple examples in the Torah where the rabbis say, no, that didn't happen. So that's, a child is certainly that parent-child relationship, or that child-parent relationship, is in the Torah considered a sort of cornerstone societal relationship that has to be kept in check.
Thank you. And I see Joyce has
Thank you.
Your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. I have a comment, because one of the things you mentioned, you don't speak, or you watch your words with a stranger, pretty much. And words have such a power, because we learned that's how the world was created. So that's what's the most important thing. And words are now what's hurting us, through the media. So it's just an awareness of how you conduct yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I do think the power of words here is what the Torah wants us to think about. And thank you for echoing that, Joyce. Thank you so much. So just a couple more Torah texts here that I think we would be remiss if we didn't look at together. The first text here is from Leviticus, from the center of Leviticus, which is often referred to as the Holiness Code. Smack in the middle of Leviticus is a section on different ethical and ritual laws. It's considered one of the later sections of the Torah, and similar to the way that I described Mishpatim, the section after Mount Sinai, or the section after the 10 Commandments, this also has a miscellany of laws. But right here, we have two different translations of verses 33 and 34, a little different than we read above. Now, when there sojourns with you a sojourner in your lands, you are not to maltreat him. There's that word again, tonu. Like the native born among you shall he be to you, a sojourner that sojourns with you. Be loving to him as one like yourself, for sojourners were you in the land of Egypt. I am God, your God. So in this verse, it should strike you that the language here is a little different. And I would argue, in the name of my teacher, Shai Held, that we see something even more extreme here. An Ezrach, or a native born, the person shouldn't just be accepted among you like, okay, so this person lives among me. They're a stranger that lives among me. I should change the way I think about that person and think of them as a citizen, as a native born. Ezrach is the modern Hebrew word for citizen, but this really means that idea. The word citizen is anachronistic. It doesn't make sense in the context of ancient Israel, but a native born among you. And we have here, this should remind you, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, be love someone like love your peer, like you love yourself. Be loving to him as you like, as Fox's translation, yourself. So not only are there these negative commandments, and by negative, I mean, don't do this, don't do that, but here, Leviticus kind of takes to the next level the ways in which we are instructed to embrace another person or who lives among us but is not exactly like us. And I'll point out the Rashi here, which explicitly thinks of this person as a convert. But again, I'm going to ask us to expand our notions here. Rashi says, again, this implies vexing him with words, but then he adds something that he doesn't include up above. Don't say to him, yesterday you were an idolater, yesterday you worshipped idols, and now you come to study the Torah, which was given from the mouth of the Almighty. Meaning, don't say to the person, there's something, I'm going to mention your past. You're trying to do something differently. You're trying to be different. You're living with me now, among me now. I'm going to raise something painful from your past. And again, this midrash, this rabbinic text, is so fascinatingly honing in on human nature in the way that the text above does. It's so easy to, it's I would say, I don't know, it's easy to either think something negative or bring something up to someone that they might want to talk about. If for some reason you're in a mean-spirited place, it's easy to go with that. But the rabbis from this ancient midrash are saying, catch yourself. Do not, if a person lives among you, don't bring up their past. Don't bring up something, and I'm expanding on this a little bit, don't bring up something that's painful to them. And then Rashi also comments on the final part of Leviticus 19, where throughout the whole chapter, we get this phrase, I am God, your God, and there, with the implication that you should therefore do the mitzvot, do the commandments, keep the commandments. And Rashi says, well, this is your God too. The God of the stranger is your God too. And again, of course, Rashi did mean by medieval times, Rashi did mean, and others did mean converts. So this is not necessarily only someone who is a stranger among you. This specifically refers to a convert according to the medieval understanding of the Torah text. But more broadly speaking, if we take the Torah text more generally, more expansively, we're getting a message here about why do we treat other people? Well, we're kind of all in this together. We all kind of want a good, ethical, spiritual life, or many of us want that. Of course, there are exceptions. But when you mistreat someone, when you call someone on their otherness, you're doing something contrary to like a general sense of spirituality. That person might be a seeker in the way that you're a seeker. So be tolerant, be open. So I think a beautiful way to end our analysis of the Torah texts and the interpretive texts that went along with them. I included here Deuteronomy also, just so that you could see another text. You should love the strangers, for you were strangers in the lands of Egypt. And the ancient rabbis say that the commandment to all these different variations of the commandment of treating the stranger with respect and dignity appear 36 times in the Torah. And there are different counts of that. There are different mentions of that, but there are, that is the tradition, that there are 36 different times. And the point, of course, is that this is a law that comes up again and again and is considered extremely important in the way that we treat each other. So I'm gonna keep going a little bit, and I want us to take a look at a few texts here. You can see through text 7 or 8. I mentioned earlier that it gets a lot harder. The messages in the Bible are so clear about treating a stranger appropriately. And I didn't even quote any of the prophetic texts, the texts primarily from the middle section of the Hebrew Bible, where the ancient prophets chastise the people for not treating the widow and the stranger and the orphan with respect, with enough respect and dignity. And so we get something a little different in medieval times and in late antiquity. These texts really, for the most part, unfortunately, the texts about another kind of person or a Gentile among you, they're for the most part quite negative. And you can do some Googling, and there's a lot of academic work on this, but they're not fun. From a modern sensibility, they are not fun to go through those texts. It is not fun to go through those texts, but I think, again, I want to ask ourselves the question of, even among a set of texts where most of those texts might be uncomfortable for us as moderns or negative in some way, can we find some kernels of positivity and respect and dignity? And can we anchor ourselves in those? Can we anchor our own spiritual, religious, intellectual lives in those texts? So I want us to explore some of those texts together. So this text is from what's either called the Palestinian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud, which was written in the lands of Israel. There's a Babylonian and a Jerusalem Talmud. They were the one written in Babylonia is in Jewish tradition considered the more authoritative one, but there are a lot of texts from the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud that are quoted and worth taking a look at also. So I'm going to go ahead, and again, you have the Hebrew on your right to follow along, but I'm going to read in English. Rabbi Levi said, God will judge the world in righteousness, and God will judge the nations in truth. And that's from Psalms. The Holy One, praise to him, judges Israel during daytime when they are occupied with mitzvot, with the commandments. And the nations God judges during the night when they are resting from averot, from sins. So far, not so great, but there's a little bit of redemption here. Samuel, another rabbi, but he's just called Samuel. Samuel said, God who judges Israel also judges the nation. How does Samuel understand that God will judge the nations in truth? God judges them according to the qualified among them. God remembers for them the deeds of Yitro. God remembers for them the deeds of Rahab, the prostitute. So I'll fill you in a little bit. Who are these people? There are, some of you might already know, but for anybody that might not, just in case, there are these characters like Yitro and Rahab who are not Israelite in the Hebrew Bible, but who help the Israelites in some way. So Yitro was Moses's father-in-law, his wife Zipporah's father, from the land of Midian. And Yitro advises Moses on delegating so that Moses does not have to do all the work judging the people himself. And we read about that in early Exodus. Rahab is from the book of Joshua, where she helps the spies. There's a spy story, Israelites who come to scout out the land in the book of Joshua, and she helps keep their secret that they're coming to scout out the land before they conquer it. and her family is saved, says the story, when the land gets conquered. So again, this isn't a completely positive text about relating to non-Jews or non-Israelites, really non-Jews by this point, but there is a kernel here of, wait a second, let's not interpret or connect sin as dramatically to non-Jews, to Gentiles, as the text might allow us to. But Samuel says, wait a second, let's think about the righteous Gentiles among the Gentiles around us, and let's remember that God judges them positively. And so it's something. So I think that the next text maybe is a little bit more inspiring. From both the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud, the Mishnah is a collection of laws from about the year 200 from the land of Israel. The Babylonian Talmud is often explained as a commentary on the Mishnah, but is much more expansive, including both law and lore. So the Mishnah, I'll back up. In the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says, one does not protest against poor Gentiles who come to take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and the produce in the corner of the field. We read about that at the beginning of the class, which is given to the poor, although they are meant exclusively for the Jewish poor on account of the ways of peace. So the Mishnah is saying, why do we not, even though the law in the Torah seems for the poor and the stranger, this leaving some of our property, our fields for the poor. Rabbi Yossi says, we can't stop someone who's not Jewish from taking from the fields, because in Hebrew, because of darchei shalom, because of ways of peace. So again, not an ideal text from a modern sensibility, but there is the sense of like, we're not out to, let's not be provocative. And now we'll read a little bit more, maybe a little bit more positive in the Babylonian Talmud. The Mishnah teaches one does not protest against poor Gentiles who come to take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor and called peah, as mentioned above also, although they are meant exclusively for the Jewish poor on account of ways of peace. What the Mishnah says. Similarly, and now this is the Babylonian Talmud, the sages taught in a Breita, an earlier text, one sustains poor Gentiles along with poor Jews, and one visits sick Gentiles along with sick Jews, and one buries dead Gentiles along with dead Jews. All this is done on account of the ways of peace to foster peaceful relations between Jews and Gentiles. So there's a little bit of an expansion here on the Mishnah with the idea that visiting the sick, burying the dead, helping the poor, those fall under the category primarily of the mitzvah, you should love your neighbor as yourself. And that's really considered, for the most part, applying to Jews. But the rabbis in the Talmud say, no, we're not about being provocative. We do not want to make anyone angry. And I would read into the text a little bit more. Maybe we want to do the right thing. And it's hard for us to say that in the language of our time. So, and a little bit of an expansion of perhaps equalizing in some way the treatment of Jews and non-Jews. Okay, text 8, a little bit confusing, but we're going to read it. So also from the Babylonian Talmud, and the context of the verse, let me just see if I can, okay, great. For whoever muted, thank you. The context here is about how when non-Jews give charity, give tzedakah, they don't always have altruistic motivations behind that action. Also, again, not the most redeeming text. But we're going to read in one opinion, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, a minority opinion, an early rabbi, and we'll see maybe a text that's a little bit more redeeming than we might expect. So Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana answered and said, he's responding in this discussion based on a verse, righteousness, and you might read righteousness and kindness, exalts or raises a nation, and offense leads to want among the peoples. This is from Proverbs. This is referring to Israel, and in addition of the peoples of sin. So that's not so clear, but the positive part of the verse says Rabbi Nechunya is referring specifically to Israel, to the Jews, and the negative part of the verse is referring to non-Jews. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says to his students, the statement of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana appears to be more precise than both my statement and your statement. So without giving too much background, we'll see what Rabbi Yochanan says, because he assigns both righteousness and kindness to Israel and sin to the peoples of the world. The Gemara asks, the Babylonian Talmud itself asks, by inference, it appears that he, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, also offered an interpretation of this verse. What is it? And here's really the text that I want us to pay attention to. As it is taught in an earlier text, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said to them that the verse should be understood as follows. And this is not a literal reading, but I'm going to read it and explain it. Just as a sin offering atones for Israel, so too charity atones for the nations of the world. Now, I'm just going to back up for a moment to the verse, because the verse itself is quite difficult in translating. There are different translations of the verse, but there is this idea in the verse that righteousness raises up a nation, and chesed, acts of love and kindness, atone for nations. So really in the verse, if you read it as literally as possible, you would read that charity, tzedakah, or righteousness, and also chesed, acts of love and kindness, can both redeem other people. A traditional ancient rabbinic understanding of this is that only if we read the verse positively, that those positive parts only apply to Jews, whereas in Hebrew, this word chatat, sin or atonement, depending on how you read it, that the sin is associated with other nations. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no, let's not read it in a negative way. A sin offering is how he reads that word chatat. It atones for Israel. And so too, sin offering allows Israelites to redeem themselves after if they've made an error on a sin in biblical times. And so too, tzedakah, righteousness, or charity can atone for the nations of the world. So without going into too much detail from the earlier interpretations, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is offering some kinds of redemption for the non-Jews that he reads out of this verse. So it's not just the Israelites who are associated in positive ways with either tzedakah or chesed, with righteousness or acts of love and kindness. Also, tzedakah is connected here as a way by which those who are not Jewish, Gentiles, can atone in the world. So again, none of these texts are perfect, but they're not awful the way some other texts are. So just in thinking about all these texts together, when we study the God of the stranger, when we study the very emphatic ways in the Torah that we are commanded, that the Israelites are commanded to treat the stranger, that those laws later on really become seen as laws applying to converts, whereas they don't, for the later rabbis after the time of the Bible, they don't unfortunately apply to Gentiles. What I tried to pull out here was nevertheless some kind of positive verses when entering into Passover, preparing for Passover, and thinking about the directives in the Bible that are so strong. I wanted us also to think about, is it possible to see some later rabbinic texts, perhaps in some way in light of the positivity and the injunctions in the Bible? I want to get to, and I'm going to pause for a couple questions, but I also want to get to a couple of modern thinkers, Martin Buber and Shai Held. And I just want to mention Emmanuel Levinas, who died in 1995 and was a philosopher and also wrote very much about the way we should be treating the other. But let me pause here before we get to some contemporary readings and see if there are any clarification questions or other questions on the rabbinic texts or anything so far.
So there's people in the chat sort of responding to the concept of the stranger. But I see that Joyce has her hand raised again. And there's something nice about hearing a voice. So if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. But for now, Joyce, if you have a question.
Do you mind another statement?
Sure. Go ahead.
Before you went into the depth, excuse me. Before you went into the depth in the introduction, I think the one thing that hit me, because we shy away from things that make us feel bad. We shy away from, we did something wrong. We don't like that feeling. And actually, that's part of the human nature. And that's what Judaism really taps into that. And so even though things are negative, even though it shows that we've done things in the wrong way, it also provides a way to do it and change it and make it better. And that's the beauty of Judaism. Face your humanity. Know that you're not perfect. There are two sides to you, the good side and the bad side. It depends on how harmonious you are inside as to which you go to. And everybody, Jewish or non-Jewish, and this is the point, has those same possibilities. And if you treat people, God created us, is my feeling. And everything he created is good. And tikkun olam is to make what he gave us even better, because within our nature of choices, we don't always make the right choices, which is what this is alluding to. So the point that we're given in Judaism is, yes, you will do some wrong things. Yes, you will be ashamed for a lot of the things you might do wrong, but there's a way to make it better. There's a way not to just keep yourself in that negative hole, but to do actions that will make it better. Whether you are Gentile, whether you're Jew, there's this possibility that you can make
Joyce,
the
I'm
world
just going to
a better
ask you to
place
wrap
together.
up, just to give other
Oh,
people
honey?
a chance to speak.
I'm
I'm
sorry.
just going to ask you to wrap up. That's
We're
okay.
done. I'm done.
No, it's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, but really, Joyce, thank you so much for participating, and also for sharing the idea of, like, these texts help us call our attention to what does it mean to push ourselves to be better and to do better. And I think that's exactly what the laws of the stranger do. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
I also saw Meira's hands raised.
Yes.
So
Meira, if you're here, I'm asking you to unmute. Okay, so Meira put her hand down.
Okay.
Well, we have a second hand, Paula.
I think it's really interesting to look at these texts as North Americans, because essentially we are strangers in this land. This land is not ours, was not ours. And if, as a Canadian, looking at this text through the idea, which is a big thing here in terms of truth and reconciliation with First Nations peoples, if we are the strangers, and we have to acknowledge that we are the strangers, because up here, for example, I live on Treaty 6 land. It is not mine. It was and historically belonged to those First Nations. It changes how you read the text.
Yeah, and I think absolutely. I mean, 110%. And I would say also, in some ways, Jews in North America are strangers, and in some ways, there are other people that are more, I would argue, more prevalent strangers. A stranger often implies someone at a possible disadvantage who could be easily taken advantage of. That's the implication that goes along with a stranger. And if based on the Torah, on contextual reading of the Torah text. So if that's the case, then the Torah is trying to say, do not take advantage of someone who is vulnerable. Do the right thing and go above and beyond to do the right thing. And so I think when we read these texts today, we do have to ask ourselves, are we strangers? Is someone else a stranger? And also, I would argue, and this Rabbi Shai Held suggested, if we look, what are the parts of us that we don't want to see? And I think someone said this, or maybe it was Joyce or Paula, maybe you just said it, but I heard it today. What are the parts of ourselves that we don't want to see? What are the strange parts of ourselves? And we're going to conclude with a quote from Scheiheld that speaks to this a little bit. What do we do with those parts of ourselves? Do we get annoyed and separate ourselves, and therefore separate ourselves from those parts that we are unattractive to us and other people? Or do we work on our relationship to ourselves and therefore also thereby work on our relationships with other people? So Paula, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen, and we're entering into the last 8 minutes of class together. Whoops, let me just find my screen so I can see all of you. If those who are not on camera want to come on for just a few minutes, it would be great to see more faces. So I can see a few of you, and for those who are on camera, thank you so much for staying on camera this whole session. It definitely is enjoyable to be able to look at faces and learn with you. So we're gonna read together these last 2 texts here and think about how a modern thinker and a contemporary thinker can impact our notion of the stranger. So Martin Buber famously wrote about the I-thou relationship. I talk about this text a lot. Others may be familiar with it. So I'll go ahead and read it, and then we'll chat a little bit about it. The word is twofold. The word is twofold for man in accordance with his twofold attitude. The attitude of man is twofold in accordance with the 2 basic words that he can speak. The basic words are not single words, but word pairs. One basic word is the word pair I, you. The other basic word is the word pair I, it. But this basic word is not changed when he or she takes the place of it. For the I of the basic word I, you is different from that of the basic word it. And he says in another area of the book, there's no I as such, but only the I of the basic word I, you, and the I of the basic word I, it. In other words, what he's saying here, 2 things, and again, some of you may be familiar with this, is that as a person, I am only an I when I'm in relationship with you. I'm not an entity unto myself. I'm not an island unto myself. I'm always, from the time I come out of the womb, I'm always in relationship to someone or something else. And if I'm in relationship with that person, and that person is just an object for me, like a newborn latches on to their mother and just takes from their mother. But as we grow up, we slowly, hopefully, develop relationships where the person is not just an object that we take from, but a person that we relate to. And I will say, I heard Professor Jonathan Brafman say that when he teaches in college classes, he always gives the example, and I love this. I really am excited to relate it. He always gives the example of like a young couple sitting at a campfire, and like they're totally enraptured with each other, and they're just totally open to who the other person is and really excited to share of themselves. And he says he always gives that example because he teaches college student and it speaks to people. So this idea of really encountering someone for who they are with full acceptance and curiosity, and also sharing of yourself. That's the I-you relationship. And Emmanuel Levinas, a later philosopher, also talks about this in terms of my relationship with God as the other, but also when I treat other people with the utmost dignity and respect, I also that is a reflection of the way that God treats other people. So I think the Martin Buber I-thou, even though it's not specifically to speaking in the context, he's not speaking in the context of strangers, sort of universal here, certainly in this pre-Passover exploration of the empathy that we're commanded to have. This I-thou kind of relationship also, I think, can impact us in fostering that kind of empathy and compassion. So we'll end with this last text here from Rabbi Dr. Scheiheld. He says this idea of loving the stranger, dignity and respect for the stranger, is so well known that it's hard to hear how radical it actually is, because there's nothing obvious about it. We can imagine an emotional logic about being strangers in the land of Egypt, and no one cared. So why should you care? But here we have another poll. Since you were vulnerable and downtrodden, oh, sorry, you must. And then I didn't finish typing that. Victims of trauma have both voices inside us. If you had my mother, you know I don't owe anyone anything. In my ways, the moral life is tied up with how I subdue or heal the former voice. In other words, when we experience trauma or difficulty, we can say, okay, I'm done with that. I don't need to treat anybody else with anything. I managed to surpass that. I don't care about anybody else. Shai says that the Torah radically commands the opposite. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. You cannot now say, you are fine now, and you're going to treat other people the way that you want. You were strangers in the land of Egypt, and you have to always be thinking about, how am I treating the stranger? And he talks about, and I mentioned earlier, I would argue, how are you treating the parts of you that are strange to yourself? Because if you are focused on embracing the parts of you that you don't like with compassion, you will also have an easier time showing compassion to others. So the Torah is asking us to think about taking the high road here, not choosing to treat someone with disrespect when we feel that we've surpassed a time of disrespect, but in fact, treating others with the utmost dignity and respect, because we know that in our experience, that wasn't part of our earlier experience. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. And if people have other questions or reflections, you're welcome to email me at abby@explorejewish.com and just give me a little bit of time to respond. But next week, we'll be back for, in addition to God of the Stranger and God of Love, we'll also be talking about God of Freedom, but really exploring freedom in relation to being in a covenant, which is the next step after leaving Egypt and Mount Sinai. So I hope to see all of you there, and thank you so much for coming today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again. And we really appreciated your participation today. And we will see you next week. Thanks so much.